But panpsychism specifically, what have you found useful in the conversations that have occurred around it in recent years?
Well, I think that for me, my background commitment to physicalism has always centered on the quest to understand mental causation. And while I understand that epiphenomenalism is a conceptual possibility and there's all sorts of like logically possible scenarios where consciousness doesn't have kind of a role to play in producing behavior, I just find it intuitively tremendously compelling that the mind causes physical things and that physical things cause mental things. Compelling enough to the point where I think that a theory which made that the case is a better theory than one that doesn't. And you could debate about that, and there's tremendous debate, whatever. So, but that's my own assessment. So, in fact, the traditional case against dualism kind of centers on how does the mental causation work, which I don't think is fatal to traditional dualism, by the way. But anyway, it's a good starting case. So that's why I was always attracted to the identity theory. And I didn't really like functionalism very much. I've kind of become more friendly to functionalism in my old age, but in my early days, I was like, no, functionalism bad. But functionalism probably okay. Anyway, so the identity theory gives you the most satisfying view. If the mind is the brain, then mental causing physical is just physical causing physical. So physical causing mental is just physical causing physical. So or mental causing mental, depending on how you want to do these things. So I used to spend a lot of time thinking about the identity theory and being upset that people would say that posit these identities and then treat them as though they're distinct. In musical theory, that happens a lot, by the way. People recognize that like G flat and A sharp are the same note, but that it's useful to treat them as distinct. And then you get people saying, no, they're not the same note. They're just enharmonically identical, which means they sound the same, but they're different notes, don't you know, because they're in different scales and they appear in different contexts. So great. So it's useful sometimes to treat the things as distinct, even though we recognize that they're really the same thing in some set. Or even, I don't know, musicians might debate me about whether they're really the same thing. As far as the sound goes, they're really the same thing. So there's only one sound there. Anyway, so it's kind of interesting when you get into this debate. And that's how I was thinking about the identity theory, is that there's only one thing there, the mental state, which is the brain state. And then like what I found is that people will maybe say stuff like that, but not really take it seriously, like that there is the same thing, that they still want to preserve them as distinct. So I spent a lot of time talking about that, but the main motivator for accepting that view was the mental causation stuff. And functionalism, I was, always kind of puzzled by how you get the same view, because it's the abstract state, which is what the mental state is, right? Not the implementation of it. So, and there's a whole bunch of debates about that. I'm not trying to say that's a knockdown argument or anything, but it was something I always was puzzled by. So I always thought identity theory was the best view if you want to explain how the mind and the brain interact. It's just they're the same thing. So no problem. So I know you asked me about panpsychism. I didn't forget. But how does panpsychism come in is because it showed in a kind of clear way, I think, that there can be a non-physicalist version which gives you a kind of mental causation in the same sort of way. I mean, I even like quantum versions of dualism because they allow the mind to like play a role in collapsing the wave function. Although they don't give the mind much control over the outcome of the collapse, they do allow that it has some causal effects. So I even think, those aren't bad views. But anyway, so if you take the modern version of panpsychism, which says, okay, so physics tells us what these things do, but not what they are. So maybe what they are is consciousness. Well, then if the brain is composed of a bunch of physical states and those physical states really are consciousness, then when the brain does something, it's consciousness doing it. So if that identity is true, then you can understand why the mental state is having some physical effect. So making that, to me, that was the benefit of panpsychism. It made clear that you could have a version of this theory which is compatible with like what science says, which actually has precedent in history because physics has introduced new fundamental entities. The field is the big example, which everyone talks about. So maybe you need to postulate some fundamental entity, consciousness, and then see if you can explain it. So that's what I found useful about that discussion, was it opened up this discussion about what the causal role of the mind was and how a non-physicalist theory might try to account for that. I'm not saying it's successful, because people will still ask questions about it, and there's still objections. But that's why I think, I mean, where I get off. So what the reason why I don't become a panpsychist and I still prefer physicalism, even though I don't have zero belief in panpsychism. By the way, I would say I have a little, a small amount of who the fuck knows classified as over there. So anyway, but the reason why I don't the needle doesn't point over there is because I just don't buy the arguments that are supposed to defeat physicalism, namely the a priori conceivability arguments. So I just think that it conditional on you finding that stuff defeating physicalism, then panpsychism is worth taking seriously. And what riles me up and makes me angry is when people act as though it's obvious that physicalism has been defeated or refuted. By the way, I don't believe in physicalism. Like I said, I'm a pretty skeptical person. What I believe is that physicalism hasn't been refuted by a priori arguments. So I think that we don't have a reason to think it's false, not a reason to think it's true. So I don't know if physicalism is true, but I don't think that zombies or conceivability arguments about Mary and what she may or may not learn leaving a room tell us anything about the nature of consciousness. That's where I object. But if you find that that's sufficiently compelling, then I think panpsychism is a serious view. And I don't know, the idea that consciousness is just a brain state is pretty mysterious, in the sense that some people have said, gee, I don't know how that could be the case. But other people have said, how could anything be the case? So I'm kind of in that camp. I mean, I don't know, why is water H2O? It just seems like some things just are, and that's the way they are. And then what we do is figure out how they work and not why they are that way. I think that's a weird way to think about what science does, as telling us why. I mean, Aristotle thought about it that way, I would say. That Aristotle thought the job of science was to tell us why things have to be the way they are, necessarily, that they have to be this way. And then his answer was they have essences of a certain sort. And then you want to find out what those essences are. And then you know what the thing is because you know what makes it that way. In a way, it's kind of, echoing Plato, but in his Aristotelian way. So great, that's wonderful, but I don't really think of that as doing what science is trying to do, is tell us what the nature of things are. So a lot of this will boil down to what your views about philosophy of science are.
Right. There's these are all good points, but I think it's just sometimes a little frustrating when people want to knock down all of neuroscience or psychology or cognitive science, saying that they've failed. But I mean, these things are so new, just give them some time, let them develop a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think that the persons who are non-physicalists, who are really committed to that view, sort of don't see what you could discover that would change the way it is. So, I mean, I sort of get where they're coming from. It's the most general version of the argument is just that, you're going to learn about the structure and dynamics of the system, but consciousness seems to be somehow not involved with structure and dynamics. And I agree that it seems that way. You could work yourself up into a rather dizzying flurry over this. And if you meditate or take the right drugs or have other sorts of experiences, it can become really compelling that, gee, well, something about this consciousness stuff that's unique and even feels fundamental, maybe. But the only question is whether you should take that face value, or what reason we might have for thinking that this is misleading in some sense. So I don't even know if it's a matter of like needing more details or further science. I mean, obviously that would be great. But like my own view is that we should, like what I call, deprioritize the a priori arguments. And deprioritize, I sort of stole from the, war on drugs literature in America, where they were decriminalizing and deprioritizing enforcing certain rules, but they weren't making it illegal. So now things have changed somewhat, but they were for a moment, they were saying, look, it's not necessarily legal, but we're going to deprioritize it, which means we're not going to instruct police officers to enforce this rule. So it's as though it's still on the books, but we'll ignore it for a while, in essence. And I sort of thought, gee, that would be great to do, but with zombies. Zombies and Mary. Let's deprioritize those things in just this way. Let's not say they're worth nothing, but let's just put them on the shelf for a while, because they're not telling us anything useful at the moment. I think at the moment what they're doing is telling you like what you already believed about consciousness and making it explicit. And the analogy that I sometimes use is sort of like going back to water. If you if you asked Aristotle what water was, he would say it's a simple substance with no parts. It's obvious, like look at it. And then if you said, yeah, but water is like a substance made of hydrogen and oxygen and this bond and this chemical bond, he's like, no, there's no parts to water. And then suppose that Aristotle said, look, I know that your view is false because I can conceive of a world where there's water, but no parts. And then he said, so therefore, this has no parts. Well, you would kind of go, gee, that's great, but we know it does have parts. So there's got to be something wrong with your thinking that you can like conceive of this situation. You either have to say that you misconceived it in some way, or that this is just telling you sort of, it's giving voice to your own theoretical commitments in a way. So that the idea that I had was that in the fullness of time, if we knew everything, then the a priori arguments would be great because we could a priori deduce this stuff and know what's right. But that you have to know first already. So that I do think that this is the reason I started this rant, because of your comment that you said we got to give the science time. So my first response was, well, maybe you don't. But then on the other hand, maybe you do, because it's only after we sort of have answered a bunch of these other questions that we're going to be able to say with any kind of confidence that we should change the concept of consciousness such that it does have some functional connection, so that some connections are made, or that we see a way of making these connections a priori, or of recognizing that, dualism is right because these certain inferences can still be made even after you know all the details. So I do think that if in the end of time, you could look at all the details and then know whether physicalism was true or false. But that requires like knowing everything about the brain and the way the world works in a way that we don't.
On the flip side, on the physicalist side, what do you take away from the other big consciousness theories? So global workspace theory and IIT specifically.
Well, I think they're interesting and they could be right. So, just like every other theory of consciousness, they have reasons for taking them seriously and reasons why they are taken as seriously as they are. And there are objections to them and reasons for wondering whether they are on the right track. So with global workspace theory, it's not 100% obvious to me what being globally workspace has to do with consciousness. I sort of know what it has to do with control of behavior and pushing buttons and walking around and stuff. But if that stuff can be done without consciousness, then which that's an open question. But so it's not clear that there's any relation to consciousness at all. Um, if these things can be done without consciousness, so then it becomes a big empirical question that you would want. And by the way, we don't know the answer to whether there's these forms of unconscious processing. A lot of people think there are, but it turns out really hard to try to nail it down. Anyway, so yeah, I don't think it's wrong, obviously, but I don't think it's right, obviously, either. So furthermore, I think that global workspace in particular has enjoyed some level of popularity because people take evidence for it that actually is ambiguous between different kinds of theories. So like higher order theories, for example. People say, well, look, when you see this consciously, there's activity in the frontal cortex. When you see it unconsciously, you don't get that activity in the frontal cortex. So this supports global workspace because global workspace says you got to have activity in the frontal cortex. But I'm simplified, but that's very vague. Because what kind of activity, what is it doing? So if that activity is a kind of inner awareness, then it's not being in a global workspace that matters, it's inner awareness. If it's being in the global workspace that matters, then we need to know the activity associated with that and look for it. So it seems to me that, some of these, the same can be true for like first order theories, like people who say re-entry processing, that it's not just feed forward from the visual area, but somehow higher order visual area is feeding back. Okay, great. But what does that feedback mean? Is it a kind of inner awareness? Is that the neurological signature of inner awareness? Some higher theorists have said maybe. Other people have said no. Other people have said, well, maybe the signal that you're seeing in global workspace theory is really a kind of back propagation from the higher order system that's correcting errors that you can get. So how to interpret what the activity we're seeing is open in all of these cases. So I don't really think you can, at this point, I don't think we can say that the global workspace theory is or isn't supported by this or that evidence without go looking at the details and say, have you ruled out this interpretation and that interpretation with respect to these higher order theories, which hasn't really been done. People haven't really, so this is the area where I think that should be done. Okay. My own kind of sneaking suspicion is that global workspace theory is a very good candidate for like giving you the states which you could be aware of, that the states that the higher order states represent are the states in the global workspace. But who knows? We have to wait and see. Now, as far as IIT, I think that's a different story because IIT tries to start from the nature of consciousness itself, so to speak, deduce some truths about that, then postulate some axioms on the basis of that. And therefore, a lot's going to depend on the analysis of consciousness that you begin with. For example, one of their axioms is that consciousness is unified. That even though there's different parts of my experience, it's all somehow knit into one unified experience. And intuitively, maybe that's seemingly the case, but it's not obvious that it is the case, especially once you start to look at what's going on neurologically. Could there just be the appearance of unity? Is it maybe that we seem to have a unified experience, but maybe we don't? So I don't know what the answer to that question, but IIT assumes an answer to that question and then tries to build a theory of consciousness around it. So that to me seems to be, you have to be very careful because it's not clear that these axioms should be universally accepted. So also, for example, they don't include anything about higher order awareness. So that, they just say consciousness exists, consciousness consists of information and differentiation, blah, blah. So there's various things, but nothing about inner awareness. So if higher order theories are on the right track, they just exclude them by fiat. So that seems to me to be, something problematic. On the other hand, once you get to like their actual postulation that consciousness is integrated information, this again seems to me something that's more associated with the things we wouldn't want to call consciousness. So this, Ned Block has said this seems more like intelligence when you have information that's integrated. in a way that allows control or whatever. Um, I would want to say that this looks like what you would get from first order states. Like, why couldn't you have integrated information in first order states without any kind of inner awareness and therefore not consciousness? So just like with global workspace theory, I think that probably this is a candidate of what first order states are, which states we could be aware of, rather than a theory about what the nature of consciousness itself is. Plus, there's all sorts of weird stuff about IIT and the exclusion postulate, where they say that if there's integrated information and two systems have integrated information, then the system with the most integrated information is the conscious one, where the lesser one is not conscious. And that has the weird implication that you could become unconscious by becoming integrated to a system that was more conscious, more phi or whatever, as they put it. So, I think these theories are interesting, and they have led to some testable, they have tried to test some of these ideas. I think the kind of zip and zap stuff that they do, where they've used to try to figure out whether there's integrated information in like coma patients or persons in anesthesia, by stimulating in a particular area and then measuring the spread of that stimulation, and trying it as a way to try to determine how interconnected the various areas are and how much integration there is. It can give you some useful information, but I think that people who like IIT, when they talk about like a consciousness meter or building something that you could like use to determine whether a coma patient was conscious or something like that, I think we're a long way from that theory being able to do something like that, even if it were right, from being able to build something like that. So these other theories, I don't have as strong opinions about them as maybe some other people do, but I do kind of have strong opinions about people saying this one is, more empirically supported than that one, or something like that, because I think that these theories are all supported to some degree or other by the empirical evidence, in the sense that there's no obvious contradiction with any of the empirical evidence. You can tell a coherent story from each of these points of view. So what's more important than developing the theories and cherry picking a bunch of data and saying, look, I'm consistent, is making a prediction that can then be tested. That say, here's what the theory says you should find, and then you should go and be able to find it. Or confirm it or disconfirm it, to some reasonable degree. Remember, nothing's knocked down and all that stuff. But so, I think that we're only just now starting to see this happening, actually, where people are recognizing that we've done enough theory developing. We have, this handful of big ideas that are at every conference. You're hearing about versions. It's like we got IIT, we have higher order theories, we have now higher order theories anyway in the last 10 years. We have theories based on attention, global workspace theory. But when you look at what these people are actually doing, what you find is that there's not a lot of crosstalk, and that each paper, which is presenting some evidence, is testing one of these theories using a particular methodology. And actually, when they did the analysis, they could determine which theory was going to be supported just by looking at the approach. So if they use like this change blindness approach, you can tell it's going to be like a global workspace theory and that they're talking about. Or if you use this other, so it's like these little silos of these theories, where there's people that are interested in theory doing a certain kind of work based on that theory, but there's not a lot of connection between the two, saying, hey, my theory says this, what does your theory say? Let's test them together jointly. And recently there's been some attention to this exact issue of trying to get these guys together in some way to make joint predictions that can then perhaps narrow the field down or help us consolidate these ideas, or somehow, move towards a standard model or a working model or some sort of general background assumptions about how these terms should be mapped onto the various empirical things. So, the Wild West is trying to be tamed. We'll see if they succeed or not. We're hopeful, but you never know. I mean, the Templeton Foundation is funding some of this research, and there's a big project with IIT and global workspace theory. And, you know, you can have your various feelings about Templeton one way or the other. Some people do, but all I can say is that they're willing to put up a lot of money to help try to accelerate um, these results. I mean, some people think this is a bit dangerous because it fosters the idea that there's like a definitive experiment by which you could prove or falsify these theories, and no one really should believe that, as we've been saying this whole time. But I still think that it's important to get people together, say, what does your theory actually say, and how is it different than his over there? And now, what would it mean about what we could test? And so that's promising, at least. Anyway, so you're asking me what I got out of these other theories. That's what I would say is that each one's interesting, but it's time for them to sort of get out and talk to other people more.
Yeah, the administrative side of studying consciousness is real weird. Like on one end, it feels like it should be its own field with people working together, but on another end, it seems like, well, no, these things are so complicated and they draw from so many different fields that you can possibly imagine how that would work. So it's difficult to imagine how you would blend these things together.
Yeah, exactly. So it's difficult. And that's why you sort of see it kind of split in the conferences. So we have the Arizona conference, the Science of Consciousness, and then you have the Association for the Scientific Study of Consciousness. And they were sort of formed by mostly the same people at mostly the same time. But the difference between them was always kind of that one was, more inclusive and one was more cognitive neuroscience based in a sense. That one was focused more on the like normal science of the day, and one was like, would allow more exploratory approaches, quantum mechanics and, conscious universes and stuff. So in that sense, yeah, you can kind of see that there's this general broader field called consciousness studies where people are interested in these more general questions. And then the more narrow field of the cognitive neuroscience of consciousness, where what we're interested in is just using the models from neuroscience and cognitive neuroscience in particular, as we understand it now. Can we generate a kind of model for what conscious experience is? And we have some of these things, maybe, I can't really think of a good one, but, think of something like deja vu, or, I don't know, whatever. We have a pretty good understanding of what might count as an explanation of that in terms of like unconscious processing, triggering of memories, given some visual cue that you're not consciously aware of. And then you mistaking the sense of familiarity from the triggered memory with the thing that you're currently visually perceiving. So we have a set of cognitive mechanisms that we've developed in other areas, change blindness and implicit processing, unconscious processing, etc. Priming. So there's a bunch of stuff. And then we could use that in this other explanation. So that's kind of how I think of the cognitive neuroscience of consciousness. Like we have a bunch of stuff that we've been talking about. We have representations, we have cognitive, we have theories of perception. Using those ingredients, can you say anything about consciousness? And that's what the theories that we have are trying to do. Outside of that are the theories which are more metaphysical in nature, which, like panpsychism, I sort of think of as compatible with any of these views in a way, because the panpsychist says, look, there's these fundamental things that are conscious, but then they have to be put together some way in a way that results in your consciousness. So maybe that has something to do with IIT, or maybe that has something to do with higher order theories, and maybe that has something to do with first order representations, maybe some way when the brain becomes organized and thus in such a way, the little tiny ingredients are put together and thus in such a way. So I don't know, I'm not a panpsychist, but I think that even they could kind of just sit back and wait to find out what the ultimate neural correlate of consciousness was and say, yeah, great. And so that's going to be part of our explanation for why human consciousness is the way that it is. Even though in order for there to be consciousness at all, you might have to postulate that the, quarks or fundamental elements are conscious in some fundamental sense. So I sort of see them as separate projects. One is dealing with I don't think science really deals with metaphysics. I mean, science everything that neuroscience tells us could be true, even if idealism was true. So idealism just says, everything is mental, and then great. So we're studying the mental then. But it still might work like that for some reason. Yeah. So, yeah, sorry, I kind of trailed out there, but I got an email just binged in my ear and I was reading it. Sorry. But anyway, my point is that I think there's I was trying to say there's two separate projects, I think. And you were saying, it seems like these guys should work together. On the other hand, it seems like they're coming from such different areas. How could they work together? So I would say, yeah, it does seem like in one sense there's two separate projects. One, the metaphysics about the nature of reality. Does consciousness have some deep place in that nature of reality? And then the other one is like, given what we know about the brain, can we construct a theory which tells us something about, well, I would say human consciousness is where you want to start, but just consciousness in general would be great as well. And maybe you might think that they go together in some way, but I think they could largely be separated, in which case, the cognitive neuroscience of consciousness can kind of just proceed along, and the panpsychists and dualists of the universe can kind of just go, cool, and not really have any beef with it, because the real debate comes when you say, look, could you have that and lack consciousness? Is this like the necessary sufficient conditions for conscious experience, etc.? And there you get into all the other debates which are waiting, no matter what your ultimate theory about how the brain does what it does is. So I don't, by the way, just to sum this up, I don't think that it's an objection to panpsychism to say that it's not empirical or it doesn't make it predictions or something like that, because it's starting from the assumption that there's a piece of data which isn't explained, namely the existence of consciousness, and then postulates something to explain it. Whereas the physicalist starts from the assumption that you don't need that other thing. So, but they both agree that the science says the physical world works this way.